This farmer's stupid honey trick gave millions of American soldiers an edge. On a moonless night, a long line of trucks slipped past German listening posts and into a gap in the hedgerows. The engines made no clatter. The axles made no scream. Men who had spent weeks learning to move like ghosts felt the movement as if they were passing through cotton. It should have been a slaughter. Instead, it became a lifeline. Watch to the end to learn how one farmer's stupid trick changed that night and why history almost forgot it. Subscribe to the channel if you want more untold stories told plainly. Напишите в комментариях, из какого города вы смотрите это видео. He was not a tinkerer by trade. He was a man who knew soil and bees. He rose before sunrise and measured his days by the sound of wings. The farm sat off a gravel road that did not appear on many maps. Neighbors called the place simple. The man called it work. The war arrived as paperwork first. Requests for grain, for feed, for jars. Then the calls changed tone. A military truck came one morning and left with wooden crates and a stamped form. The note on the form asked for more than honey. It asked for something that would last, that would not rot on a shelf, that could travel and sit under rain and still be useful. The farmer did what farmers do. He adapted. He had watched bees build seals with propolis and wax. He had watched his father smear wax on axles to stop squeaks in a tractor. He had once mixed old oil with wax to hush a hinge when a barn door cried, and a newborn calf slept. Small, practical acts stacked in his memory like a tool set. He began to experiment. The first mixtures were crude. Honey, beeswax, a little oil, heat and stirring. Thick globs that clung to the brush. He tested on an old pickup that had long ago been demoted to the yard. The door no longer barked when it closed. The exhaust seemed to lose its metallic bite. He did not know about airborne acoustic detection or interception reports. He only knew the hinge no longer squealed. Word travels in war the way smoke does, fast and without ceremony. A sergeant at a depot saw a coated axle and thought it was odd. A logistics officer thought it was promising. A small crate was packed and sent across the ocean. The farmer kept stirring and labeling and loading. Production became part of his day. The bees did not care for names or medals. They thrummed on. Back in the theater, the compound earned a nickname because soldiers need names. It moved from depot to field unit to front line in the same way a rumor grows into a strategy. Men who had prepared for ambushes found their ears betrayed by fewer telltale creaks. Night convoys arrived where they were expected to arrive. Supplies reached units that had been on the edge. The farmer's life narrowed to a pattern of heat and cool, of jars and drums. He did not seek credit. He did not ask for a list of where the barrels went. The proofs came as brief notes in envelopes, as a single photograph, as an order that demanded more output. He kept a ledger and a log. He kept the routine. The chemistry, when it mattered, was simple and stubborn. The compound damped vibration. It sealed seams. It chased off the electric hint that gave away a machine at distance. In theaters where sound bands could be swept by aircraft and where men listened for the telltale notes of engines, a muted convoy could pass like a shadow. That small advantage multiplied into hours, into miles, into tons of material delivered. Not every shipment mattered. Some trucks still broke in half under fire. Some nights the fog and the maps failed. But on one route, a planned ambush did not yield the expected harvest. The attackers heard nothing until it was too late. The after-action notes called the change temporary, modest, situational. The men who owed their lives called it a miracle. The farm kept going. The war kept moving east, and the orders stopped as abruptly as they began. New labs and new methods took up the work at scale. The compound faded into a single line in a long report. The farmer returned to his tasks, to boxes of frames, to the steady pull of seasons. No parades came. No headlines named him. He kept a jar on the shelf and a single folded note tucked in the lid. The story that mattered for the men who rode those trucks happened in the space between sound and silence. It began with a hinge. It moved across an ocean in wooden crates. It landed on cold roads under a sky that did not care which side would win. It almost did not happen at all. At the edge of the chapter, something else arrived. A photograph, a worn field jacket, and a line that would change how the farmer thought about what he had made. The next chapter will follow that line across a muddy field and into a convoy that should have been lost. He had never imagined that work done in silence could echo so far. Yet long before any crate left his property, the shape of his life had already narrowed into a pattern that would soon collide with a war greater than any forecast on the radio. He had been raised on routines built from necessity, not inspiration. Morning checks on the hives, quick repairs on tools that had lived past their time, notes scribbled in margins of old ledgers, tracking weight, yield, and small shifts in the health of colonies. The world measured him through narrow definitions. A farmer, a keeper of bees, a man whose work fed others but rarely earned notice. That was enough for him for many years, until the war began to reach even the quiet corners of the Midwest. The first changes were small: ration books, shortages, requests from the local officials. He watched neighbors leave for enlistment offices with stiff shoulders and loud vows. He carried the weight of a knee injury that had followed him since youth, and the draft board ruled him unfit. It was a single moment that split his life into before and after. Others were sent into danger, and he was told to stay among fields and hives. Some envied him. He felt only a hollow sense of guilt, because safety can sting as sharply as duty. Reports from the front arrived in bursts, names of places he had never heard. Towns wiped off maps he had never seen. Supplies were pulled into military routes. New demands fell on farms with little warning. He watched officials walk past rows of hives with the same urgency they gave to stockyards and grain stores. Honey became a commodity with strategic value simply because nothing else could fill its place. It lasted. It traveled well. It resisted spoilage, and it came from work that did not sleep. The farm shifted. More hives, more hours, more weight loaded onto a back already worn. Yet even through this steady pressure, something else began to take shape. A sense that his isolation, once a burden, could become a strength. No one asked how he managed to maintain such yield. No one inspected the small shed behind the barn where he began to store his experiments. His world stayed narrow, and the narrowness protected the early steps of the idea that would grow beyond him. He did not record the first moment, when he thought the mixture might matter. It came without ceremony, while he stood beside a hinge worn thin by a decade of winters. A hinge that had always announced its movement. After a quick swipe of the new blend, the noise faded, replaced by a soft glide. It was an unremarkable detail, yet it carried a weight he could not name then. Silence had power. Silence could save time and calm nerves. Silence could hide presence. In war, silence could mean the difference between a column spotted at distance and a column that passed unseen. Each evening he returned to the shed. He altered the ratio of wax and honey. He heated batches until the blend changed texture. He tested on scraps of metal pulled from broken plows. The surface gained a dull sheen that resisted friction. He noticed how water rolled off the layer, how the metal lost its ring when struck. The observations were small. Together, they formed a truth he tried to ignore. His work was drifting beyond the fence line of the farm. The shift became impossible to deny when the military truck returned. The visit was brief and the request simple. More honey, more jars, more weight. He watched the crates leave the yard and felt a quiet strain tighten in his chest. Supplies went east. Supplies supported men under fire. He had been judged unfit to stand among them, yet his labor would now travel in their place. It should have comforted him. Instead, it deepened the ache left by the draft board's verdict. He continued to study the reactions of the compound on metal. He tracked how long the coating held at different temperatures. He measured how the mixture behaved under pressure, not out of ambition, but out of instinct. He had lived long enough on a farm to know that tools must earn their worth. If something fail, it fail when needed most. And so he pushed each test harder, as though the metal plates and old parts in his yard were stand-ins for something he could not name out loud. One evening he held a jar of the compound in both hands and felt the weight settle. He understood what he had made. Not a solution, not a breakthrough, a possibility, a chance that his forced distance from the war might not be the end of his service, but the start of another form of it. Something that did not require boots or rifles. Something that belonged to him alone. The chapter closed on a moment he would recall years later with uneasy clarity. He stood at the door of the shed as dusk settled. Hives hummed with steady rhythm. He watched shadows stretch across the yard and sensed without evidence that the quiet world he knew was shifting. The next time a truck arrived, it would not come for honey alone. It would come for the mixture he had crafted without plan, without guidance, and without any clear sense of what it might become once it left his hands. The next shift in his life arrived without warning, carried not by orders or letters, but by the familiar grind of a military truck rolling onto the gravel path. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when farm work slows because daylight is nearly gone, but chores are not. He stepped out of the shed with hands still marked by wax and oil and saw the same olive vehicle that had taken his honey weeks earlier. This time, the truck stayed in place. No crates were unloaded. No forms were handed over. The engine remained on, humming in a low, steady tone that did not match the tension of the moment. A young corporal climbed down and walked the yard with measured steps. There was no urgency in his stride, but there was purpose. He glanced at the hives, the barn, the shed. His eyes lingered on the metal scraps leaning against the wall. The farmer understood immediately that this visit was different. Supplies could be taken by any driver. Inspections came only when someone higher decided a change had occurred. The corporal asked a few simple questions about volume and conditions, nothing unusual. Yet he kept circling back to the shed, as if the air around it carried a clue he could not name. Inside the shed, the smell of the compound hung thick. It clung to rafters and tools. The farmer had grown used to it. Others had not. The corporal paused at the doorway, scanning shelves packed with jars sealed in wax. He asked about maintenance. The farmer answered with the plain truth. He had been using the mixture on hinges and joints. The doors no longer scraped. The metal lasted longer. It was only natural to use what he had. The corporal gave a slight nod, not approval but acknowledgement. The conversation ended quickly. The corporal left with a brief note that production targets would increase again. The farmer watched the truck vanish down the road. He had the uneasy sense that the shed had revealed more than he intended, though he had not hidden anything. He returned to the mixture that evening with sharper focus. If the military had noticed, then someone somewhere had connected small dots he had not meant to place, and once that connection formed, it would not be ignored. Days passed quietly, but the rhythm felt off. He worked, but he listened more. The distance between the farm and the war seemed to shrink, not in geography, but in consequence. Crates no longer traveled away in anonymity. Each batch carried a weight he could not share with anyone. Neighbors spoke about shortages and ration cards. They did not know that in one dim shed, a mixture was being refined that could silence machinery and reduce the metallic bite of engines. They had no reason to ask. He had no reason to tell. The breaking point came 1 week later. A different truck arrived. Not a supply vehicle, but a sedan with military plates. 2 officers stepped out. Their uniforms were plain. No decoration. No ceremony. They walked straight to the shed. They had a list of questions. They wanted ratios, temperatures, sources. They inspected his tools with a precision that made it clear they had seen similar compounds tested elsewhere. When they examined the coated plates near the workbench, silence hung in the room like a held breath. One officer tapped the surface of a metal plate with the end of a wrench. The tap produced only a dull thud. No ring, no echo. Only a soft, muted response that carried none of the usual signature. The officer tapped again. Same effect. The men exchanged a look that held more calculation than surprise. Without raising his voice, the officer asked how long the layer lasted in cold. The farmer answered truthfully, longer than expected, longer than it should, given the crude ingredients. The officers left as abruptly as they arrived. No explanation, no instructions, only a final note. Continue production at current volume until further notice. After they drove off, the farmer stood in the doorway of the shed and realized the mixture no longer belonged to him alone. It had crossed an invisible boundary. It had moved from the realm of farm work to the realm of necessity. The shed felt smaller. The stakes felt larger. The hours ahead would not be shaped by curiosity anymore, but by obligation. That night he worked late, refining each batch with the same steady motion of a man who understood that mistakes had consequences, now measured not in broken hinges, but in human lives. He kept the shed light on long after the fields went dark. The air grew warm from the stove. He stirred the mixture with care, knowing that the officers who had stood beside him had seen something valuable, something rare, something they intended to use. But the moment that shifted everything came the following morning. A single envelope lay on the kitchen table, carried by a mail truck that barely stopped at the gate. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The message inside was brief. It described a small test done on a convoy truck far from his farm. The coded parts ran with less noise. A patrol passed without detection. The note ended with a short promise. More tests were coming. He read the lines twice, then placed the letter beside his ledger. The truth was clear. His mixture had left the shed. It had entered the war. It had proven itself in conditions he had never witnessed. What he had built alone on a quiet farm was now moving toward front lines he would never see. The first field test should have been a footnote, but it became the spark that pushed his work out of obscurity. The note he received was carefully worded, almost too careful, as if the writer feared that any hint of praise might raise expectations. Yet even in its restraint, the message carried weight. A truck coated with his mixture had moved through a patrol zone without drawing attention. No clank from a loose hinge, no scrape from a worn joint, no sharp burst of metal that could give away distance or direction. 1 quiet mile in a war defined by noise. He read the note again that evening while standing in the shed. The light from the single bulb cast long shadows across rows of jars. Nothing about the place looked important. The tools were old. The bench was scarred. The floor held decades of dust. Yet this was where the mixture had been born, stirred into existence by instinct and repeated trial. He felt the tension that arrives when a small act begins to grow beyond its origins. The test proved the coating worked. What he did not know was how far the military intended to push it. 3 days later, another envelope arrived. This one bore a typed report. It described a sequence of engine tests conducted at a stateside facility. The mixture damped high-pitch vibration by a margin the evaluators had not predicted. In controlled trials, it reduced the signature of moving parts enough for technicians to consider new tactical options. The report did not read like praise. It read like preparation. There was no hint of where the next step would take place, only the clear suggestion that plans were forming. He returned to his routines, but they no longer felt like routines. Each batch was mixed with exact measurements. Each jar was labeled with date and temperature. He tested the coating again on a strip of metal left outside overnight. It resisted moisture. The layer remained intact. These small confirmations brought no relief. They only sharpened his awareness that the mixture was moving toward a purpose he could not fully see. In early spring, a transport truck stopped at the gate and remained there. 2 drivers stepped out and opened the rear compartment. Inside were wooden crates marked with destinations far from the Midwest. The request was simple. Fill them with the most recent batches. The volume asked for exceeded anything he had supplied before. He loaded the crates in silence, watching each jar vanish into a space where labels no longer mattered. When the transport pulled away, he stood in the dust, feeling the absence left behind. By then, the military had enough confidence to attempt something larger. A brigade preparing for movement across a coastal region requested a limited supply. The mixture was applied to a handful of vehicles scheduled for night travel. The conditions were difficult. The ground was uneven. The weather unpredictable. The patrol routes nearby were known to be sensitive to any mechanical noise. The vehicles coated with the mixture moved with steady rhythm through narrow paths and deep ruts. Observers posted at range heard almost nothing. An internal memorandum summarized the outcome in a single sentence. Noise reduction sufficient for short-range concealment. What seemed minor in writing held enormous value for units that relied on stealth during supply runs. A small advantage at the right moment could mean fewer alerts, fewer ambushes, fewer losses. Commanders recognized this at once. The mixture, crude as it was, offered something few tools could match: silence under pressure. Back on the farm, the days grew longer. He worked late into the evening as requests increased. His hands grew marked by hours spent scraping cooled wax and lifting heavy pots. He kept a ledger of each delivery, though no one asked him to. The record grounded him. It reminded him that all of this had begun with a hinge and a desire to create something reliable. The war needed outcomes, but he needed precision. He could control only what happened in the shed. Midway through the month, a final document arrived that shifted everything. It contained a directive for increased production and a schedule for shipments that would feed into a distribution hub. The quantities were far beyond anything he had imagined. The implication was clear. The mixture would not remain an experiment. It would be implemented in active theaters. The time for small tests had passed. He set the paper aside and looked across the tables lined with jars. The shed was no longer a place for quiet work. It had become a node in a chain stretching from one isolated farm to convoys moving through hostile terrain. His mixture had crossed oceans, borders, and front lines. It had earned a place in strategies planned far beyond his sight. What he did not yet know was that the next stage would reveal consequences he had not prepared for. The mixture would face conditions no test could replicate. A convoy would enter a region marked by risk, and the silence he had created would hold or it would fail, leaving men exposed. The first large-scale deployment unfolded far from his fields, yet every detail of it would reach him in fragments that carried more weight than any headline. The mixture had left his hands weeks earlier, sealed in drums and routed through depots that fed the machinery of war. He assumed it would be tested again under controlled conditions. He did not imagine it would be sent straight into territory, marked by high risk and thin margins. The convoy assigned to use the coating consisted of vehicles pulled from several units. They were old, battered, and loud in ways that could not be masked by quick repairs. Mechanics applied the mixture along hinges, joints, and exposed metal seams. They worked fast, aware that time was short, and routes ahead were known for ambush attempts. The coating dried into a dark layer that dulled the surface and muted the tone of metal when struck. The mechanics noted the change but did not comment. In war, any tool that promised small gains was accepted without discussion. The convoy moved at night. The vehicles rolled out in formation, guided by dim markers that offered little comfort. The road ahead cut through a region where patrols shifted daily. Information was imperfect. No one could predict where opposition forces might have placed listening posts. The men in the convoy carried the familiar tension of night movement, the kind that settles in the stomach and sharpens every sense. They expected the usual signs of a machine column in motion: low rumble, clatter, vibration. Instead, they heard a softer rhythm, a muted glide that unsettled them because it felt unnatural. Observers stationed along the route reported the same thing. The familiar signature of engines and metal was reduced enough that they struggled to judge distance. A patrol positioned near a crossroads heard nothing until the trucks were nearly past them, and by the time they reacted, the vehicles had already moved beyond reach. This was the first moment the coating delivered an advantage that could be measured not in theory, but in miles gained without detection. At the midpoint of the journey, the convoy entered a narrow pass bordered by dense growth. The terrain amplified sound. Even a single misstep by a heavy vehicle could betray location. The lead truck slowed. The rest adjusted. What followed was a stretch of road that had caused trouble for units before them. Listening posts had been placed near it for months, catching the faint clink of chains or the scrape of metal whenever a convoy crossed. This time the posts recorded almost nothing. The trucks moved through the corridor like shadows, not because they were invisible, but because they no longer carried the metallic edge that typically traveled far in the night air. The convoy completed the route and reached the drop point with no alerts triggered. No flares, no pursuit, no loss of cargo. The report summarizing the operation was brief, but the significance stood out to anyone who understood logistics. When movement goes unnoticed, supplies arrive on time. When supplies arrive on time, positions hold. It was not heroism. It was not strategy. It was a reduction of risk that rippled outward through every line of support. Back on the farm, he received the news in the form of an official summary, delivered without commentary. The document did not mention him. It did not mention the shed or the hours spent stirring batches by hand. It referred only to the compound's performance under field conditions. Noise was lower, signature was reduced, movement was steadier. These words were clinical, but they carried a truth he could not ignore. The mixture had endured its first real test. It had held under pressure. And because it held, the military had made a decision. Production would increase again. He stared at the order for a long time. There was satisfaction, but it came with a sense of responsibility that weighed heavier than any crate he had ever lifted. The mixture had reached a point where mistakes were no longer isolated to the shed. A flawed batch could reach a convoy that counted on silence. A misjudged ratio could fail at a moment when failure meant exposure. The work had moved beyond curiosity and entered a realm where precision meant survival. He reorganized the shed that same day. Tools were cleaned and aligned. New notes filled the ledger. Test plates were placed in a box marked for repeated trials. He checked each jar twice before sealing it. There was no audience, no supervisor. The pressure came from the knowledge that men he had never met now depended on something mixed in a quiet corner of the Midwest. As the days passed, shipments left the farm with increasing frequency. The routine was relentless, but he accepted it without hesitation. Yet even as production grew, questions lingered at the edges of his thoughts. How far would this go? How long before demands exceeded what one man could sustain? And what would happen if the mixture faced a situation no test could predict? Those questions would not remain abstract for long. A new request soon arrived, one that revealed the next deployment would be larger, riskier, and set in a region where silence alone might not be enough. The request that arrived next did not resemble the earlier ones. It carried a tone that signaled escalation, though the language remained restrained. A transport officer outlined a new operation scheduled to move through a contested region where supply routes had collapsed under repeated ambushes. Vehicles sent into that area rarely returned intact. Losses had become routine. Command wanted to test whether a broader application of the mixture could shift outcomes even slightly. The farmer understood what that meant. His work was moving from supplemental tool to critical component, in a plan that offered little room for error. The order demanded volume he had never produced. He spent the next days in a rhythm that left no space for thought. Heat, stir, apply, seal, repeat. The shed turned into a pressure chamber of tasks and deadlines. The smell of warm wax clung to his clothes until it seemed part of his skin. He slept in short intervals, waking before dawn to check cooling batches. Every jar he filled carried the weight of the region the convoy would enter, a place where silence could mean survival, but only if the mixture held when conditions turned unpredictable. In that region, patrols monitored roads from concealed positions. A single misjudged sound from a truck axle could expose an entire column. Reports described the terrain as unforgiving. Soft ground that trapped heavy vehicles. Dense growth that amplified noise. Long ridges that funneled sound for miles. The last convoys had not reached their destinations. Some were struck within minutes of entering the zone. The stakes were clear. Command needed a different outcome, and the mixture was now part of the equation. The day the coated vehicles left the forward depot, weather conditions shifted without warning. Cold air moved in and carried moisture that seeped into metal joints. Mechanics noted this before departure and tested the coated surfaces with handheld tools. The mixture held, though the sheen dulled in the damp air. There was no time for adjustments. The convoy had to move. A delay would leave isolated units without supplies they urgently needed. The mission began at nightfall. The first miles were routine. The ground was firm. The route followed a straight line toward the edge of the contested zone. The mixture performed as expected. Noise levels stayed low. The men riding in the trucks felt the difference through the absence of the usual metallic chatter that had become a constant part of their lives. They advanced with focus sharpened by the knowledge that previous convoys had been intercepted long before reaching this point. When they crossed a narrow bridge and entered the zone, every small sound mattered. The mixture had never been tested in such conditions. The cold intensified. Moisture froze on exposed surfaces. The coating stiffened. A few vehicles developed faint vibration in the undercarriage, but the noise remained far below normal levels. Observers stationed in the area failed to detect the convoy until it had already passed their listening perimeter. This alone shifted the trajectory of the mission. Then the route dipped into a shallow ravine. Soft ground forced the trucks to slow, and slowing brought new risks. Engines strained, increasing the chance of mechanical noise that could travel farther in the chilled air. The coating absorbed part of it, preserving the muted tone that had carried them through earlier stretches. A single exposed scrape could have alerted patrols positioned on the ridge above. The mixture prevented that moment. The convoy continued forward. Halfway through the ravine, a truck hit a submerged root. The impact shook the vehicle and threw its weight sideways. Any other night, the sound of metal striking hard ground would have signaled immediate danger. Instead, the coated surfaces reacted differently. The thud was deep and confined. It did not ring. It did not travel. The patrol on the ridge heard nothing distinct enough to investigate. The convoy regained formation and advanced. The mission did not remain smooth. Near the final bend, a lookout finally spotted silhouettes moving through the fog. A flare rose. The trucks accelerated. The silence that had sheltered them through miles of dangerous terrain no longer mattered. The zone was awake. But the early advantage bought by the mixture had carried them close enough to escape the choke point. Only the rear vehicles came under fire. Damage was limited. The convoy reached the drop point with the bulk of its cargo intact. The after-action report credited the mixture directly for the successful passage through the ravine and for the delayed detection that allowed the column to bypass high-risk positions. It was not a medal. It was not public praise. But it was a formal acknowledgement that the coating had shifted a mission from probable failure to measurable success. When the farmer read the condensed summary, he felt a tension he had not prepared for. His work had been validated under fire, but that truth came with a new burden. The mixture was no longer an experiment. It was a tool that men depended on, and men had been hurt using it. The responsibility felt sharper than anything he had carried before. He returned to the shed that night and began adjusting the formula again. He did not want a near miss. He wanted fewer risks, fewer losses. The order for sustained production arrived with the authority of a turning point. It carried no explanation, only deadlines. The volumes listed were far beyond anything a single farm should have been asked to produce, yet the directive left no room for negotiation. Units preparing for operations deeper into contested regions required consistent supply. The mixture had become part of their planning, a small but significant link in a chain that stretched across thousands of miles. If he accepted the task, his shed would need to operate with the precision of a factory. If he failed, gaps would form in missions where gaps cost lives. He began by clearing the shed completely. Every tool was placed in a new order. Containers were cleaned, labeled, and arranged by batch. He sketched a system on a scrap of paper that divided work into cycles: heating, mixing, cooling, sealing. It was a layout built not for efficiency, but for control. He wanted no mistakes, no contaminated jars, no rushed steps that would compromise the texture of the coating. The pressure did not come from the military. It came from the memory of the convoy that had slipped through danger because the mixture had performed when it mattered. His days became a sequence without pause. He woke before light. He moved from task to task without drift or distraction. The stove burned for hours. Water simmered in metal trays to manage temperature shifts. Jars cooled on wooden planks that once held honeycombs during harvest season. By late night, the shed felt like the center of a world reduced to heat, motion, and repetition. He tracked every batch with notes so precise, they read like the log of a laboratory. Though he lacked formal training, he applied the discipline instinctively, the way he had once tracked hive cycles. Patterns mattered. Ratios mattered. Small deviations could change outcomes in ways that would never appear in the reports he received. Requests from the military became more frequent and more pointed. They asked about cold resistance. They asked about heat endurance. They asked for variations in viscosity. These questions hinted at the environments the mixture would soon confront. Frozen roads, desert routes, coastal fronts where salt settled into machinery. He answered each inquiry, though sometimes the answer was little more than an estimate based on tests he could run with the materials he had. Yet each answer was followed by acknowledgement, which meant the mixture continued to move outward into places he could not imagine. The pressure mounted with another layer he had not anticipated: exhaustion. His hands began to stiffen. The skin along his fingers cracked from contact with the heated mixture. His shoulders carried the ache of lifting heavy pots, again and again. Yet the work did not slow. He pushed through, driven by a sense of obligation that had become inseparable from his days. The war was distant, but constant. Radio broadcasts delivered steady reminders of fronts advancing and stalling. Casualty counts rose and fell in patterns he recognized too easily. The mixture felt small compared to the scale of events, but small contributions could multiply if placed in the right moments. Then the news reached him in a way that broke the rhythm of his days. A letter arrived from a unit stationed far ahead of the last position he had tracked. Inside was a brief message and a photograph. The photograph showed a group of mechanics applying the mixture to a row of vehicles lined up in a muddy field. The coating darkened the metal. The men wore the expression of those who understood the value of time. The message beneath it was stark. Supplies had arrived after a series of delays. A previous convoy had been lost. They needed this shipment. They needed the next. There was no mention of casualties, but the tone of the letter carried the weight of loss. He set the photograph on the workbench and stared at it until the edges blurred. The men in the picture were strangers, yet they relied on something that had begun as an experiment in a quiet shed. The distance between his world and theirs felt unbearably thin. He imagined the upcoming operations and the sound of engines moving through darkness. He imagined how silence might keep men alive. He imagined what failure would sound like. The urgency multiplied with another note several days later. A new operation was scheduled to begin in a region known for dense terrain and shifting enemy positions. Convoys had been rerouted repeatedly. Supplies were running low in forward positions. The directive closed with a request that felt more like a plea. Maintain output at all costs. He tightened the system further. Sleep became irregular. Meals were brief. He stopped listening to the radio during work because it filled the shed with tension he could not afford. He isolated each step of production until the mixture emerged with consistent texture and tone. Somewhere in the distance, supply officers were planning routes that depended on the coating holding under new conditions, harsher conditions, ones that could not be predicted by any test he could perform. As the chapter drew to a close, a final signal arrived that hinted at what was coming. A courier delivered a sealed envelope marked urgent. Inside was a short message explaining that the next deployment would involve a convoy larger than any previous one, carrying equipment critical for a push into a region that had resisted advances for months. The route contained multiple listening posts and narrow passages where even a single miscalculated sound could expose the entire column. The convoy assembled before dusk, a line of machines marked by wear and urgency. Mechanics worked in tight sequences, brushing the mixture onto axles, hinges, and exposed seams with practiced movements. The coating darkened as it set, forming a muted shell that gave each vehicle a dull, uniform tone. In the fading light, the trucks looked less like individual machines and more like a single organism preparing to move through territory that had punished every attempt before them. The operation centered on a stretch of road that cut through layered ridges and narrow passes. In that region, sound carried unpredictably. A single metallic scrape could roll along the slopes for half a mile. Listening posts were positioned with precision. They did not need to see a convoy to identify it. They needed only vibrations, the faint tremor of machinery, the signature hum of engines under strain. Command believed the mixture offered the best chance to cross the zone without triggering an immediate response. It was an advantage measured in seconds, perhaps minutes. But those small intervals could determine whether the mission advanced or collapsed. By the time darkness settled fully, the convoy was ready. Drivers received final instructions. Radios were tested and set to limited use. The mixture had been applied to every vehicle with the same care he used in the shed. None of the men handling the brushes knew the farmer's name or the long hours behind each jar. They saw only the change in the metal as the coating settled into place. A few tapped coated parts with tools out of habit. The muted thud reassured them. Quiet mattered more than any other feature tonight. The vehicles rolled out with engines at low throttle. The early miles passed without incident. For the first stretch, the convoy followed a shallow incline where sound dissipated into open terrain. Drivers noted that the coating reduced the metallic chatter that usually accompanied these climbs. It did not eliminate noise entirely, but it softened the harsh edges that carried farthest. The convoy pushed forward with confidence, supported not by speed but by restraint. At the first ridge, the formation tightened. The route narrowed, forcing vehicles into single file. Visibility dropped, and so did natural cover. In previous attempts, units had been detected in this section long before reaching the tree line. Tonight, the vehicles moved as steadily as conditions allowed. The mixture absorbed vibration. Hinges that once squealed held their silence. The airflow over the coated metal produced less resonance than expected. A listening post positioned above the ridge registered faint motion, but lacked the clarity to judge distance or direction. By the time the patrol investigated, the convoy had already passed beneath them. The deeper the trucks moved into the zone, the greater the risk became. The next segment of road sloped downward into a tight corridor, where sound traveled in unpredictable patterns. Drivers reduced speed again. The coating held, but the terrain introduced new threats. Loose stones scattered under heavy tires. Unseen branches scraped the sides of vehicles. Normally, these minor contacts produced sharp signals, easily detected by nearby patrols. Tonight, the coating dulled each strike into a low, contained sound that blended with the ambient noise of wind and shifting terrain. Halfway through the corridor, the first sign of trouble emerged. A truck near the center of the formation began to struggle with a failing belt. The vibration intensified. The engine noise rose above the pattern the coating could control. The mechanic riding with the truck made a snap decision. He signaled for a halt. For a single moment, the entire convoy stopped in silence thick enough to feel. Only a narrow margin separated them from the point where patrols had been most active in recent days. A delay could mean exposure. The mechanic worked quickly. He crawled beneath the truck and applied a concentrated strip of the mixture to the affected section, hoping it would bind long enough to keep the vibration from escalating. The fix was temporary at best, but it suppressed the noise enough for the truck to rejoin the formation. The convoy resumed movement without incident. Detection remained unlikely, but the mechanic's report later emphasized how close the situation had come to undermining the mission. Beyond the corridor, the terrain opened into a plateau. This was the most dangerous point. Listening posts had clear lines of detection here. Vehicles were visible against the horizon if lights were used. Sound traveled cleanly. The convoy moved in near-complete darkness, advancing with deliberate caution. The coating played a crucial role in this stretch. Each truck carried enough weight to produce vibrations strong enough to echo under normal conditions. The mixture softened the resonance. It reduced the mechanical footprint of the column to a level that blended with the low hum of wind across the plateau. Observers stationed near the far edge later admitted they misjudged the timing of the convoy's approach. They expected machinery. Hours earlier, based on usual patterns. Instead, the trucks reached the descent point before any clear detection occurred. The delay bought by the coating gave the convoy a safe margin to begin its final push toward the drop location. The descent into the valley proved rough. Loose soil made traction unpredictable. Engines strained against gravity. Yet even here, the coating reduced enough noise for the column to maintain the advantage gained earlier. A patrol spotted the last vehicle, but reacted too late to coordinate an effective response. The leading trucks reached the drop point and unloaded cargo critical to units positioned farther east. The after-action report marked the mission as a success. The convoy had crossed a zone where previous supply runs had suffered heavy losses. The coating was cited again, not as a decisive tool, but as a critical factor in shifting the balance. It had reduced detection long enough for the convoy to pass through the most dangerous sections. When the farmer received the condensed memo, he studied it without relief. Success did not lighten the responsibility. If anything, it added weight. The convoy had relied on consistent performance. Only one malfunctioned part had come close to revealing them. He thought about that lone truck in the corridor and the mechanic who improvised a solution with limited resources. As he returned to the shed that evening, he felt the distance between his workbench and the front lines closing once more. The next operation would not resemble this one. The stakes were rising again. A larger push was underway, and the mixture was now firmly embedded in the planning. The next operation formed under pressure that left little room for caution. Units positioned along a critical corridor had reached the limits of their supplies. Ammunition was thinning. Fuel reserves were stretched. Medical stations reported shortages that could not withstand another stalled convoy. Command planned a large-scale movement to reinforce the area, a push that demanded speed, timing, and a margin of safety far narrower than anything attempted before. The mixture became part of that plan, not because it promised protection, but because every other option had already failed. The convoy preparing for this mission was larger than any previous one. Rows of trucks stretched across the staging ground, engines idling in a low synchronized rhythm. Mechanics moved through the lines with urgency, applying the coating with wide, efficient strokes. They covered hinges, axles, and wheel housings until the metal absorbed the dark sheen that had become their quiet advantage. This time the work carried a deeper tension. Everyone involved understood that the route ahead was unpredictable. Listening posts had multiplied. Enemy patrols adjusted patterns daily. A single misstep could cascade into a chain of losses. As final checks concluded, a detail emerged that shifted the emotional weight of the mission. One of the vehicles set for departure belonged to a unit the farmer knew well. His brother had been assigned to that unit months earlier. He had received sparse updates, each letter shorter than the last. Nothing in those letters suggested the unit would be placed on a convoy of this scale. Yet the confirmation arrived through logistics notes sent with the production order. The realization hit with a force he had not anticipated. For the first time, the mixture would not only support strangers, it would follow someone he knew into danger. He tried to steady himself by returning to the routine of the shed. Yet, routine did nothing to quiet the thoughts that pressed through each task. The coding had proven itself, but it was not infallible. Conditions could strain it. Terrain could expose weaknesses. Human error could undo its advantages. He worked through the night, adding extra layers of testing to each jar scheduled for the final shipment. Perfection was impossible, but effort was all he had left to give. Hundreds of miles away, the convoy moved into formation as sunset drained the last traces of light from the sky. Drivers adjusted their grip on the wheel. Mechanics secured tools. The mixture had settled into place, thick and uniform. The trucks rolled forward, one after another, until the entire column stretched like a spine across the darkening landscape. Radio use remained minimal. Every man in the convoy understood the role silence would play in the hours ahead. The early part of the route offered no warning of the conditions to come. Open fields allowed sound to disperse easily. The mixture softened the clatter from aging machinery. The engines remained steady. The convoy advanced without raising alarms. Yet the sense of containment grew with each mile. They were moving toward terrain that had punished every force that attempted to cross it. The first sign of danger came in the form of a broken fence along the roadside. It seemed insignificant, but scouts had interpreted it as a marker. Opposing forces often used such disruptions to track movement. The convoy slowed quietly. The coating reduced noise enough for the trucks to reposition without sending vibrations up the ridge. The decision bought them time, though no one realized how little time remained. Ahead lay a stretch of road known for amplifying sound, like a funnel. The ground dipped, and the steep walls on either side carried echoes far beyond normal range. Command had hoped the coating would reduce detection long enough to pass through the zone. What they did not anticipate was the sudden arrival of a roaming patrol that had changed its schedule hours earlier. The patrol paused at the edge of the high ground, listening for the telltale hum that usually signaled convoy movement. What they heard instead was a muted shift of engines, barely strong enough to rise above the wind. The mixture bought the convoy seconds, precious seconds that allowed the lead trucks to slip beneath the ridge before the patrol reacted. But seconds were not enough to carry the entire column through undetected. A single truck near the rear hit a loose stone, sending a low, sharp bump across the metal. The coating softened it, but the altered schedule meant the patrol was closer than expected. The noise reached them, faint but distinct. A flare rose. Light burst across the sky in a white arc that exposed the terrain below. Drivers accelerated. They pushed forward into the narrow throat of the route with no room to scatter. The coating continued to reduce the harshest sounds, buying what advantage it could, but the element of surprise was gone. The patrol mobilized quickly. Gunfire followed, striking the ground and the sides of a few trucks near the tail of the formation. In the chaos of movement, one truck veered off the center line, its tires losing grip as it swerved to avoid debris. It slid toward the ditch, its coated surfaces dull beneath the flare's glare. The driver fought to regain control. The mixture offered no protection against terrain, but the muted scrape of the undercarriage kept the patrol from pinpointing the truck's exact position. The driver corrected the slide and rejoined the formation. Seconds later, the flare burned out, plunging the route back into darkness. The convoy surged forward, using the mixture's advantage one final time to break distance between themselves and the patrol. The front half escaped unscathed. The rear took scattered fire but avoided catastrophic loss. By the time the convoy cleared the final ridge and reached the safe zone, engines were smoking, men were shaken, and the narrow margin between survival and collapse was painfully clear. The after-action notes reached the farmer days later. The mixture had delayed detection long enough for the majority of the convoy to cross the most dangerous section. It had softened the noise that could have exposed them earlier. But it had limits. Terrain, timing, and shifting enemy presence had pushed those limits to their edge. He read the report several times, searching for details hidden between the lines. There was no mention of his brother by name, no confirmation of his truck, only a brief statement that casualties were low and critical, cargo had arrived intact. Yet one final line stood out, a line that hinted at something deeper. The report closed with a note that would change the tone of everything that came next. Additional information regarding personnel involved in the convoy would be sent separately. The message marked additional personnel details arrived 3 days later. It came in a thin envelope, the kind used for brief formal notices. No return address, no explanation, only a stamped date across the corner. The farmer held it longer than necessary before opening it, delaying the moment in a way that exposed how deeply he feared what was inside. The war had taught him that the shortest letters often carried the heaviest weight. Inside was a single sheet. It listed identification numbers of those who had sustained injuries during the convoy. The list was short, but each line felt like a turning blade. He scanned every number twice, then a third time. His brother's number was not present. For a moment it felt like relief, yet the absence carried its own shadow. Injuries were not the only category. Some names appeared on no lists at all. The silence around them meant only one thing. They had not yet been accounted for. At the bottom of the page, a brief handwritten note stated that several soldiers from the rear section were still unconfirmed due to scattered movement during the flare incident. The message promised updates once tracking teams completed their review. There was no timeline, no certainty, just the steady, measured tone of a system that treated absence as a temporary status, even when the families involved were left suspended between hope and dread. The farmer folded the sheet, but the words stayed with him through the next hours. He moved through the shed with a stiffness foreign to his usual rhythm. Tools clattered harder than he intended. Mixture cooled unevenly, His hands shook as he scraped the sides of a pot, sending thin lines of wax across the table. He tried to recenter himself by focusing on routine, but routine no longer offered stability. His mind remained fixed on a single question. Which truck had his brother been in? He replayed the convoy report in his head. The flare, the truck that slid toward the ditch, the scraping metal, the near rollover as the driver fought to correct the skid. That moment had been described without identifying details. It could have been anyone. It could have been him. The weight of speculation pressed against every decision he made in the shed. He forced himself to examine each jar with a level of scrutiny that bordered on obsession. Any imperfection felt like a personal failure. Every bubble in the mixture looked like a threat. He reworked entire batches rather than trust a formula he had executed flawlessly for weeks. The coating had held under extreme conditions, but the limits exposed in the last mission convinced him that he could not rely on past successes. The next morning, he received a second notice. This one came from a logistics officer who had managed previous shipments. The message contained no personal updates, only an operational request. A new mission was forming. Positions near the front line reported increased threat activity. Patrol routes were tightening. Listening posts were shifting. Command believed a strategic window might open in several days, and they intended to use that window to move supplies into a position that had remained unreachable for months. The officer's note stressed the need for consistency. The coating had become an integral factor in planning. The mixture performed beyond expectations, but even the smallest irregularity could compromise a mission built on fragile timing. The message closed with a single line. Quality must remain constant, despite increased output. He read that line several times. It felt detached from the reality inside the shed. Quality did not exist in a vacuum. Quality demanded clarity, focus, emotional steadiness. Yet his thoughts looped endlessly back to his brother's unit, the unconfirmed positions, the truck that vanished into darkness as the flare dimmed. Still, he returned to work. He forced precision back into his routine. He heated ingredients in smaller batches to maintain tighter control. He adjusted cooling times by minutes at a time, studying texture and durability under varying temperatures. He took notes so detailed they filled pages each day. Every step became a safeguard. Every jar felt like a promise he needed to keep. But tension left its mark. The mixture thickened unevenly one evening. A single batch refused to settle into the smooth consistency required for application. He reworked it, but the irregularity returned. He tested variables, recalculated ratios, changed heating patterns. Nothing corrected the problem fully. The error was small but persistent, just enough to alter performance under strain. Hours passed as he stood over the stove, mixing and adjusting. At one point he paused, realizing the shed had grown silent around him. He could hear only the faint crackle of the burner. His pulse beat hard through his fingertips. He knew a failure like this could ripple outward. An imperfect coating could reveal a convoy at the worst possible moment. The smallest weakness could expose dozens of men. In that stillness, the mission stopped being an abstract series of operations. It became personal, immediate, and loaded with consequence. He set aside the faulty batch and began again with fresh materials. He worked until dawn, pushing himself to re-establish the consistency he trusted. By sunrise, he had restored stability to the mixture. The next jars cooled with the same uniform surface that had carried previous convoys through danger. As he sealed the final jar of the morning, a sound reached him from the road, a vehicle stopping near the gate. Deliveries rarely arrived at this hour. The engine cut off, a door closed, footsteps approached. The footsteps stopped just outside the shed. For a moment, the farmer stood motionless, unsure whether to brace himself or hope for news he could accept. The door opened without hesitation. A logistics officer stepped inside, carrying a folder thick enough to signal weight, but thin enough to suggest urgency. His presence alone broke the familiar rhythm of the shed. Deliveries usually came through couriers, not officers. And never at dawn. The officer surveyed the workspace with a quick, practiced eye. Cooling racks, filled jars, steam rising from the stove. Nothing looked out of place, yet the officer's expression remained tense, as if he had walked into a scene where time mattered more than courtesy. He set the folder on the table and opened it without introduction. The first pages detailed upcoming operations. They outlined routes, estimated weather patterns, equipment lists, and deadlines. The farmer recognized the format, but not the scale. These movements were larger, more complex, and more compressed than anything described before. The mixture would be required in quantities that pushed the limits of his new system. But the officer did not pause on those pages. He turned to a section marked in red. The red section contained casualty updates from the previous convoy. It stated that most missing personnel had been accounted for. The search teams identified those who had scattered during the flare incident and confirmed their positions. The officer read the summary aloud in a tone that tried and failed to sound neutral. The farmer waited, his arms rigid, his pulse sharpening every word. His brother's name appeared in the section labeled "Confirmed Survivors." The farmer exhaled, but the relief was thin, almost brittle. The officer continued reading, revealing that his brother's unit had been reassigned after the convoy. Their new position sat dangerously close to another contested zone. They were preparing for an operation where supplies would be scarce and conditions unpredictable. The mixture would be applied to equipment supporting their movement. Whatever relief the farmer felt disappeared as quickly as it came. This was not safety. It was temporary distance from loss. The officer closed the folder halfway, but he did not leave. Instead, he shifted to the reason for his unexpected visit. The mixture had reached a point where field performance needed direct evaluation. Command required confirmation that the coating could withstand prolonged exposure to cold rain, dust-heavy winds, and rapid temperature shifts, conditions expected over the next several days. Reports confirmed its value, but they also noted inconsistencies when applied under field pressure. Those inconsistencies, even minor ones, could compromise upcoming missions. Then the officer revealed the part that changed the tone of everything. Command had decided to accelerate deployments. Supply routes would tighten. Convoys would move in closer succession. Patrol activity was increasing, and unpredictability was rising on both sides. The coating remained one of the few tools giving convoys a narrow advantage. Because of that, the farmer would not only produce, it was now necessary for him to relocate part of his operation near a forward logistics point to support rapid adjustments. The idea of leaving his farm struck him harder than any report. His entire system was built inside the shed. Every tool had a place. Every process depended on controlled conditions. Moving closer to the front meant abandoning that stability. It meant working in environments he could not regulate. It meant exposure, uncertainty, and a level of responsibility he had never imagined carrying. But the officer was not finished. The officer opened a smaller envelope and slid it across the table. Inside was a short note written by one of the mechanics who had improvised the emergency fix during the last convoy. It described the moment the belt began to fail, the quick application of the coating, and the way it held long enough for the truck to rejoin the formation. The mechanic emphasized that the coating, though never designed for such stresses, had prevented the truck from being left behind. The message ended with a single sentence. If we had arrived 1 minute later, we would not have made it out. The farmer read the line twice, then a third time. The mechanic had not known who made the mixture. He had only seen what it did under pressure. Yet the simplicity of the statement carried weight that reached deeper than any formal report. It showed how thin the margin truly was, how easily success could have collapsed, how essential consistency had become. The officer closed the folder and set it aside. He explained that in the next operation, his brother's unit would not be part of a convoy. They would be waiting for one. Supplies destined for them would move through the most volatile region yet. The coating's reliability would determine whether the shipment reached them or fell short in the same place dozens of convoys had been lost. The shed felt smaller with every word. The farmer's world narrowed to a single truth. The mixture would soon affect the survival of men whose names he knew, whose handwriting he recognized, whose absence would not be abstract. He looked at the jars cooling on the racks, their surfaces smooth, their contents steady. The clarity he had lost in recent days returned abruptly. He understood what the next hours required. Relocation was not optional. Quality was not negotiable. Delay was not possible. Before leaving, the officer delivered one final message, a detail buried near the end of the report. It stated that the upcoming route passed through a section known for mechanical failures caused by sharp shifts in temperature, an area where even small noises had previously triggered ambushes. The mixture would face its most punishing test there. He left the farm before sunrise, carrying only what he could pack into the back of a transport truck sent by the logistics officer. The shed, his anchor through months of pressure, stood silent in the dim morning light. The racks, the stove, the marked jars all remained behind. Only the essential tools traveled with him. They fit into 2 wooden crates that felt too light for the weight they represented. As the truck pulled away from the property, the farm receded into a blur, and with it the illusion that distance could shield him from the front. The road toward the forward logistics point wound through wide stretches of open ground, then into narrower routes marked by trenches and temporary roadblocks. The air carried the metallic tang of machinery pushed beyond its limits. Occasional sounds of distant activity echoed across the fields, mechanical thumps, muffled engine bursts, the low churn of heavy equipment. Nothing direct, nothing immediate, but enough to remind him that the zone ahead existed under tension that never fully eased. When he reached the logistics point, it bore little resemblance to the stable, predictable environment of his shed. The area had been carved into the edge of a shallow valley, with tents, supply trucks, and stacked crates forming a patchwork system of operations that shifted by the hour. Dust drifted through the air. Engines idled without pause. Men moved with purpose, never lingering, never speaking beyond what was necessary. Everything operated under compression. Time, space, resources, nerves. His assigned workspace was a canvas tent reinforced by metal supports. Inside stood a folding table, 2 burners, and a few crates of raw materials delivered in advance. The air smelled of fuel and dust rather than wax and wood. Temperature fluctuated wildly as winds swept through gaps in the canvas. Nothing about the setup mirrored the stable environment he depended on for consistency. Yet this was where he would prepare the next batches critical to the convoy scheduled to move through the most volatile section of the route. He unpacked his tools, arranging them in the familiar order. But the familiar layout clashed with the instability of the tent. The ground sloped slightly, causing pots to slide unless wedged against crates. The burners reacted unevenly to wind gusts, causing temperature spikes he could not fully control. Even the cooling trays wobbled under their own weight. Each obstacle introduced new margins for error, margins he could not afford. He began with small test batches to assess how the environment affected texture. The mixture cooled faster than expected, forming a slight graininess that would weaken performance under vibration. He adjusted the heating time. The graininess persisted. He added a small amount of additional heated wax. The consistency improved, but lost some of the flexibility required for cold exposure. Each adjustment solved one problem and introduced another. Hours passed, and the tension around him deepened. Outside the tent, crews prepared vehicles for the upcoming convoy. Their voices carried through the canvas, short instructions, tool strikes, the steady scrape of metal under repair. The farmer worked at a pace that matched their urgency. Mistakes were not theoretical here. They had consequences measured in seconds of exposure on dangerous terrain. The pressure pressed against him from every direction. Mid-afternoon brought the complication he had not anticipated. A supply truck arrived carrying additional materials, but something was wrong with the shipment. Lids sat loose on several containers. Dust had seeped inside. One crate had cracked during transport, leaving a fine layer of grit across the contents. Contamination at this stage could be catastrophic. Even a trace of foreign material could alter adhesion, reduce effectiveness, or cause the coating to flake under thermal stress. He sorted the materials by hand, separating what could be salvaged from what had to be discarded. Each container he rejected tightened the timeline. The convoy departure window did not shift for anyone, not even for the man producing the mixture they depended on. The officer overseeing the operation visited the tent twice, checking progress without expressing concern, though tension marked the lines around his eyes. As evening settled, gusts of cold air pushed through the cracks in the tent, chilling the surface of cooling jars and forcing him to reposition them again and again. His fingers grew stiff, his shoulders ached. Yet he kept going. Every jar represented another vehicle that needed silence to cross terrain, known for amplifying even the smallest mechanical vibration. Every jar brought him one step closer to supporting the convoy that would deliver supplies to units waiting deep ahead, including his brothers. It was near midnight when the final complication struck. The secondary burner failed. A sudden sputter, then silence. The flame died, leaving half a batch far from the temperature required to bind properly. The logistics officer was summoned, but replacement parts were scarce. A mechanic inspected the burner and shook his head once, a gesture that communicated the truth without explanation. Repairs would not be immediate. The farmer stared at the half-heated mixture, aware that abandoning it meant losing hours he did not have. The remaining burner could not maintain 2 batches at once. Using open flame exposed the mixture to smoke contamination. Cooling the unfinished batch would leave it useless. Heating it unevenly could destabilize the final product. He took a breath, steadying himself. Then he improvised. He repositioned the pot over the working burner, adjusting the distance to control the temperature manually. He used his own hands, carefully, constantly, to lift, tilt, and rotate the pot to avoid hot spots or cooling patches. Sweat gathered across his forehead as he fought the imprecision of the method. Minutes stretched. His hands burned from the heat. But slowly, the mixture regained balance. When he poured the batch into jars and watched them settle into smooth, even surfaces, he felt the first hint of stability in hours. The coating had survived the failure. The batches were complete. But as he sealed the final jar, the logistics officer stepped back into the tent with news that froze him in place. Patrols reported unusual activity along the route. Sensors picked up irregular noise patterns and scattered movement. The window for the convoy might shift or close entirely. Instability along the route altered the atmosphere across the logistics point in a matter of minutes. The message from patrol units came through in clipped, urgent reports. Irregular movement near the ridge line, scattered noise patterns near the funnel corridor, and signs of shifting patrol rotations farther east. None of the signals were definitive. None confirmed an immediate threat. But together, they formed a pattern command could not ignore. The safe window for the convoy had narrowed, and there was a real possibility it might close completely. The logistics officer returned to the tent with a pace that revealed more than his words. He presented the situation in direct terms. Patrols had detected intermittent mechanical noise, too faint to classify, but strong enough to suggest increased activity on the opposing side. Listening posts reported unusual echo patterns, possibly from equipment repositioning. Nothing pointed to a blockade, yet everything hinted at a risk that could crack open under pressure. If the convoy moved at the wrong moment, the route could shift from dangerous to lethal. The officer emphasized one point: the mixture might become the deciding factor. If the coating performed at peak consistency, the convoy could pass through the unstable section before opposing forces resolve their own movements. But any irregularity, no matter how small, could expose them. The officer's voice remained controlled, but the undertone carried urgency. They needed certainty at a moment when certainty was in short supply. He asked to inspect the jars. All of them. The farmer stepped aside as the officer and two mechanics examined each jar under field lamps. They checked texture. They checked weight distribution. They checked cooling uniformity. The earlier contamination had left him rattled, and the burner failure still echoed in his mind. If any jar showed a flaw, the entire mission might be delayed, and a delay meant supplies would not reach the units ahead, including his brothers. The mechanics worked through the rows methodically, the tent filled with the quiet hum of inspection. The farmer remained still, watching the process with the controlled tension of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. When the mechanics finished, they exchanged brief nods. No irregularities. The coating held. But acceptance did not end the danger. Patrol updates continued to shift. At one point, a report described faint metallic rhythms across the ridge, possibly tools striking equipment. Another report claimed unusual silence in the area where activity had been constant the day before. Silence, in this context, carried its own threat. It meant preparation. It meant waiting. Command reviewed the data, adjusting the timeline repeatedly. Midnight became early morning. Early morning became a moving target with no fixed hour. Drivers slept in their seats. Mechanics hovered near their tools. No one left their post for more than a few minutes. The entire logistics point felt suspended between readiness and restraint. As the farmer waited for the final decision, he prepared additional tests inside the tent. He checked small samples under different temperatures. He warmed a jar to ensure flexibility under rapid heat shifts. He cooled another to verify durability in freezing air. Each result held steady. The mixture remained reliable despite the chaos surrounding its creation. Yet the tension inside him did not ease. Shortly before dawn, the decision arrived. Command would move ahead with the convoy. The unstable signal suggested opposing forces were repositioning, but not yet prepared for engagement. That thin gap, the narrow slice of time between uncertainty and danger, was the only window available. The convoy would have to cross the volatile section quickly, silently, and without forming a detectable pattern. The farmer carried the sealed jars to the staging area himself. Mechanics began applying the coating immediately, their movements sharp and practiced. Layers spread across metal surfaces in steady, deliberate strokes. Engines remained off to preserve silence. Each vehicle transformed from raw machinery into a muted shape, built for movement through risk. As the last jar emptied, a runner approached with a message for the officer. Patrols had detected an isolated burst of sound near the ridge, followed by complete quiet. The officer froze for a moment, processing the shift in tone. The message carried no detail, only the stark truth. The instability had intensified. No one could predict what it meant. Drivers climbed into their vehicles. Engines stayed cold. They waited for the signal. The farmer stepped back from the formation, watching as rows of coated trucks took position in the dim light. The mixture glistened with the matte finish he had worked to preserve even under the impossible conditions of the tent. Every batch represented hours of risk. Every layer carried the trace of decisions made under fatigue and pressure. The logistics officer approached him with one final update. The first section of the route remained clear. The unstable signals persisted farther ahead, but intelligence suggested opposing forces were repositioning rather than preparing an immediate ambush. It was the best chance they would have, and it might be the last. The convoy began to roll out, engines firing in near-perfect synchrony. The sound was muted, softened by the coating in a way that made the machines feel weightless for a brief moment. The trucks moved toward the narrow corridor, the same stretch where noise had amplified during earlier missions. The farmer watched them disappear into the early dawn haze, aware that silence alone could not guarantee their passage, but it could decide whether they made it through the first, most dangerous section. As the last vehicle vanished from view, the officer received a final transmission. Short, ambiguous, a single line that struck with the force of a warning. Patrols detected a faint, irregular vibration near the unstable zone. Source unknown. The next chapter will follow what the patrols discovered, how the convoy confronted the unpredictable threat ahead, and what happened when the coating faced its most critical moment, under conditions